Welcome to another episode of Hearthstone Hypotheticals, a show where I ask questions on my Hearthstone Twitter and we see exactly what the community is thinking about any particular topic that I have been asked. In today's topic, we are asking, what is the best deck of all time in Hearthstone? Can be by your own definition of cool, best, or good. The best and funny replies will be featured in a future video. And honestly, this is something that I'm really looking forward to because there are a lot of different decks here. We're not seeing a lot of people just saying the same stuff. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into the best decks in Hearthstone's history, according to my Twitter, of course. And to start things off, Neil is talking about how he always had a soft spot for Mech Warrior during the Dr. Boom expansion. I'm assuming he's talking about Boomsday because this is when Dr. Boom Mad Genius came out, and obviously Mech Warrior had a ton of support with cards like Omega Devastator, Omega Assembly, and like I said earlier, Dr. Boom Mad Genius, because let's be honest, that card really made everything flow so perfectly in that deck. But it was essentially Control Warrior with mechs as well, to where you could storm the board with mechs that had rush, that had different abilities, or you could just play the standard Control Warrior game and just kind of out-armor your opponent. But they also had Archivist Elysiana, so fatigue plans were very much encouraged with this particular deck. But I would say that this deck is pretty cool. It's not the coolest deck, I would say, in Hearthstone history, but it was definitely a cool way that Warrior could actually not only kill you through fatigue, but could kill you through active threats. And Warrior really hasn't had a lot of game plans like that, at least in the control style of this deck. So I really like Dr. Boom Mech Warrior for that reason compared to the other Control Warriors. But if you want my honest opinion, it's really hard to beat old-fashioned Wallet Warrior. So I'm always going to have a soft spot for Wallet Warrior over Mech Warrior, in my personal opinion. Tough Hunter is saying that he'll always have a soft spot for Deathwing and Hunter with Deathstalker Rexxar to top 100 Legend. The value that I get here, and pretty much he's just showing a Cube Hunter. And yeah, this is actually one of my favorite Hunter decks. Actually, my favorite Hunter deck of all time, because I absolutely loved the eggs and the cubes and the dinosaurs that you could play in this deck. And there really haven't been a lot of late game Hunter decks that felt this good compared to all the other mid-range stuff in aggro decks that Hunter is definitely known for. This is the only control deck outside of maybe Spell Hunter, if you want to consider that a control deck, but this one is definitely one of my favorites for sure. And so as you can see from the screenshot, he's about to summon a full board of 5/5s and get rid of these Annoyotrons as well. But the biggest thing about this deck is just the versatility. Deathstalker Rexxar automatically opens up a new world of amazing beasts and amazing synergies outside of what's already in the deck. And if you want my personal opinion, one of my favorite combos with this deck was actually to play Shaw into Cube, so that way I could have two Houndmaster Shaw so they could both attack. There's a lot of ways that this deck was very, very creative and interactive, honestly. One of the most interactive decks I've ever seen in Hearthstone, even when you did high roll with it. So Blizzard, if you're listening to this, I want Rexxar to have some more late game strategies that encourage the King Crush combos. Right now, we do have Beastmaster Leonox, or however you pronounce that card, that can bring out multiple King Crushes from your hand if you happen to generate copies, but I don't know, man. I loved Carnivorous Cube, was my favorite Hearthstone card, one of my favorite Hearthstone cards of all time, and I would love to see something like it return in the future. Tim is talking about Quest Rogue, and no, we're not talking about Below the Caverns. We're talking about the Weapon Quest Rogue, to where you want to try and find as many random cards as possible from other classes. I have played Quest Rogue in Wild for about a year. I'm lucky to get to D10 most seasons, but I love it because it's full of Discover cards. I feel it feels like a present every time I discover a new card. I feel like Rogue is actually, at least in Wild, is a very healthy version of what Discover can be, because Thief Rogue is just an archetype that every single game is different. I would say that if you're wanting to play this version of the deck, I would actually not opt in the quest, and instead I would play Spectral Cutlass, just because, durability and lifesteal is very, very important for Rogue to be able to survive into these ridiculous late stages of the game that can be enabled because of random discovers. But with Quest Rogue by itself, he's talking about the one with the immune weapon, the immune 3/2. I forget exactly what it's called. But I really haven't seen that deck become too popular, so I'm not surprised that he is having some struggles getting to D10. But it literally creates its own game every single time that you have a game that lasts more than 5 turns. And so that's why I enjoy those style of decks, because you really need decks that have a lot of different branches and paths and whatnot. But it's even cooler when a deck literally just, you get to fight with random cards from other people's classes. And it's not game-breaking like Priest just rediscovering every single win con that it needs to win the game. So I definitely am going to give points for Quest Rogue being a cool deck because we really don't get to see a lot of decks like this shine, and when it works, it feels like an honest-to-God game of Hearthstone. Niller is saying that Niller is saying that standard Treant Druid in early 2020 because it was the coolest deck that he ever played. The cool thing about it is that it felt like you were in control of your own little forest, and all the card art looked connected in some way. You got your small little trees, and you just got to keep playing more of them. So I think that he's talking about a particular deck that Pheno actually popularized right when I think Skullman's Academy came out, because of Guru the Might Tree. I don't know if that's exactly the expansion that it came out, but during that that wave of cards in Skullomance, Druid got a lot of support for not only spell cards, but for Treant archetypes as well. And there was one particular deck that Pheno used where he literally just got to summon a board full of trees almost every single turn, and if you were able to play Guru the Might Tree, then summoning a field of 2/2s instead of 3/3s really did go a long way. So I'm pretty sure that's the deck that he's specifically talking about, and I can actually understand that being one of his favorite decks because Token Druid and Spell Druid feel like they've just been the same decks for year after year after year. Like, you just summon a big board, you buff your big board, you kill your opponent quickly before they can kill your board, and that's pretty much it. At least with this other version of Druid, you had a mid-range strategy, you also had the burst strategy like Token Druid is known for, or you can maybe go into the late stages of the game and just generate wave after wave after wave and just, chip away your opponent's health after the courses of many turns. So this is a deck that I would like to see a little bit more get a little bit more power, just because I'm not a fan of what Token Druid has become. And at this point, PC Gamers literally made an article about how everybody, even the casters and the players, do not like Token Druid, just because, good lord, I'm just not a fan of dying on turn 3 or turn 4 to the same strategy over and over and over again. So Token Druid is something that I don't really enjoy. I would like to see Treants get a little bit more support, maybe their own tribe. Not sure if that's going to be the greatest thing for Hearthstone because of cards like N'Zoth and stuff like that, but it would still be interesting nonetheless. Mohammed is saying Highlander Galakrond Rogue, and honestly, this was a deck I had a lot of fun with too. Before Galakrond was nerfed, there was a lot of different ways that you could tech this particular deck, and one way that people decided to tech it was with a deck full of tech cards and Highlander capabilities. And honestly, like Dragon Queen Alexstrasza for 0 mana, getting your Togwaggle for 0 mana was insane. Like, there was just so many good 0 mana cards that came with the Highlander package because you could just run one of everything. So you had a bunch of greedy cards, you had your tempo when you needed it in the early game, and then you had these explosive turns once you played your Galakrond. And let's be honest, playing a turn 7 fully invoked Galakrond as Rogue was not really that difficult unless you were dying. So the Highlander Galakrond Rogue, I'm guessing, is the reason why this card ended up getting nerfed in the first place, because good lord, the swing turns were absolutely freaking massive. I might try to bring back this archetype in Wild one of these days now that Galakrond has been reverted, but unfortunately for Standard, Galakrond Highlander Rogue just kind of was a little bit short-lived, but it was definitely an insane fun deck while it lasted. Nathaniel is talking about Turtle Mage, the ultimate control deck. Free wins against Priest and other control decks. Guess what, guys? I'm a Turtle Mage sympathizer, and I'm a Turtle Mage enthusiast, so guess what? Tortolin did nothing wrong. This is actually one of the most fun decks that I've ever played in Hearthstone, and I mean ever. The best part about Turtle Mage, aside from the fact that you were uninteractive against all of the control decks, I can't deny that, was the fact that you literally got to build your own win con. There are so many different ways of being able to meme with this deck in order to play it seriously, in order to actually, like, make your turns every single phase. Like, oh my god, there was just so many different routes that you could take. Like, if you guys don't know about the power of this deck, I will try to find a link. I'm not going to promise anything because the link might be expired. But Grandmaster Eddie and Egglwaffle were two proponents of this deck when it first came out, and I remember with vivid memories about how much fun it was to sit in that stream and see them like put the pieces together on what was the best version of Turtle Mage. Because when it first started, people were playing Mogus, they were playing Nightblades, they were playing anything with a freaking battle cry that was interesting because this deck was so freaking cool. I am sorry that Turtle Mage was such an uninteractive deck, but when you were behind the wheel playing it, this felt like the most big-brained, awesome Hearthstone deck that ever existed. It may not be my favorite, but I would actually say that Turtle Mage is top 5 in my favorite Hearthstone decks. So trust me, this deck may have been uninteractive, but it was cool as all hell. Lazy Peon is talking about the Forge in the Barrens Spell Generation Priest, so it's literally today's meta of Priest. I actually really like Control Warrior and Galakrond Priest. So there's 3 different decks that he listed here, and I'm just going to start with the Priest one, and then we'll go into Control Warrior and Galakrond Priest, because I'm just going to have 1 or 2 sentences about that one. But the first one, there's one word. There's only one word here, and that is Priest that matters. Priest has just reached a point where it just discovers, and I've already made a video talking about this, asking if Priest is a problem, and using people in the Hearthstone community and their own words to be able to describe why I also believe that Priest is a problem. But the biggest thing about this is just Priest just feels unfun to play against. Like, even though you have a 45-55 in a lot of matchups, it just comes down to whether or not they get the random discover, and that is just not a healthy thing for the game. Priest is just way too powerful for things, for reasons that it isn't, like, okay. Priest is so powerful that it doesn't matter what you run in the deck, it just matters what you find in the deck, because the random generation is literally that powerful. So unfortunately for Lazy Peon, I can't really agree with this, because I'm not really a fan of how this Priest deck wins. I have played it and I have won with it, but unfortunately this is just one of those things to where I just can't agree with it, because the frustration that comes from this deck is just too real. Control Warrior is a different deck, because I like to think that it can actually actively kill you versus just always playing fatigue like Priest seems to do. And the only reason that Priest can kill you is because your opponent runs out of resources to actually actively kill your stuff. And that rarely happens. I mean, nowadays it feels like it's pretty easy for Priest to do that. But Galakrond Priest was a great example of that, because all they wanted to do was press the button, get a minion, play a minion, and pressure you with it. And then use their own spells in order to support those cards with like AoE and whatnot. But Galakrond Priest was also really, really annoying to go up against. Why is it that Priest always has the annoying archetypes? I don't know. Maybe it's because of the healing aspect. They're always getting away from you and stealing your wins. I really think that's the biggest reason why a lot of people hate Control Warrior and hate Control Priest, because of those exact moments where they're one damage away, and then their opponent does something to where they gain like 30 life, and it's like, well, I hate my life now. And unfortunately, some people are just not going to be happy with that kind of gameplay, but you do need to understand that is something that is going to happen regardless. But Spell Generation Priest, not a fan. Control Warrior, always been a fan of, and Galakrond Priest, I don't know, man. I guess I don't like the Priest decks that don't actively kill my opponent. Lil Nenko is fondly remembering the time that he hit rank 3 legend on day 1 with Tempo Quest Mill Shaman. And this is definitely a deck that I haven't seen, so I wanted to keep this deck list up here for so you guys know exactly what's going on. But what appears to be going on with this particular deck is that not only does it have Evolve shenanigans to where you can just cheat the game in that aspect, but you also have cards like Kool-Aid Oracle and Shudderwock in order to just mill your opponent. And I'm just wondering how exactly he was able to get such an insane win rate with this deck. But Shaman was pretty wacky when Corrupt the Waters, and Evolve was definitely like running the ladder. Like, let's be honest, Evolve Shaman was the deck to play back when Rise of Shadows was first introduced. And Doom in the Tomb really gave Evolve Shaman so much freaking ground that it was ridiculous to not play this deck. But I'm looking at the list, and it's just like I'm finding a hard time on how exactly he won the game here, outside of just like Kool-Aid Oracles and Life Drinkers. So, Lil Nenko, if you're watching this video, let me know exactly how you perform with this deck, because this is one of the reasons why I don't feel like I'm a great Hearthstone player, because every now and again I'll see a deck like this and I'm like, how does it win outside of like 1 or 2 ways? Like, I'm assuming this deck has some comeback ability, because you have Sandstorm Elemental, you have Lackeys, so Lackeys can literally do everything, and you have a card like Devolve, so I'm probably just not giving this deck as much credit as it deserves. After all, Lil Nenko did hit day 1 legend with this and ended up spotting himself into rank 3 at one point, so the deck definitely has some power to it. Whether or not it has power nowadays, definitely up for debate, but it is definitely still a cool deck nonetheless. Danny Donuts actually took a very literal response to this tweet and said the best deck of all time was the first one that broke the wild format, the Naga Warlock. Arguably the best Warlock variant that ever was, but I enjoyed the Hunter version more because you could tech a Toxic Arrow plus Unstable Ghoul for the absurd amount of mirrors that were on ladder. So this is actually a pretty interesting talking point, because he's talking about the Naga Warlock, which literally was all about summoning a board of 8/8s as early as turn 4. I have a very fond memory of playing Wild for the very first time and literally just storming anybody that I happened to go up against. Like, it wasn't even fair, some of these matchups that you had. Like, Danny does bring up a good point about how the Hunter version was kind of the counter pick to a degree, because it had cards like Toxic Arrow and Stable Ghoul, so that way you could completely clear the entire board if your opponent had the crazy pop-off turn that Naga Warlock was known for. But this was definitely a great case to nerf Naga to 8 mana. And this has actually been the most, outside of like Garrison Commander or outside of like Warsong Commander, the Naga nerf was definitely the most impactful, because it went from 5 mana to 8 mana, and I don't think we've seen another nerf go up a whole 3 mana cost in order to try and curb the card's power. So this definitely gives you somewhat of an idea about how powerful this is. And for those of you who don't really understand how this interaction works, since Giants get discounted because of their own natural ability, when you play Naga Sea Witch, it literally makes all of your cards 5 mana, right? Well, the Giants are discounting themselves still, even though they're naturally at 5 mana. So if you have 5 cards in your hand, Mountain Giant costs 0 if you've lost 5 HP, and if you're playing a Warlock, you definitely have. Your Molten Giants are going to cost 0. Like, literally all of your Giants are going to cost like 1 or 0, depending on how you order them. So, unfortunately, this was just one deck that was obscenely powerful. Like, Wild turn 4 lethals are always going to be some of the most toxic things that I can remember in Hearthstone, because things like SnipSnap Lock, things like Starliner Druid, like there's a lot of really amazing combo decks that were possible on turn 4, and this was probably the first one that really emerged, because that was the first time Wild was created. But Naga Warlock and Naga Hunter are definitely up there for the best decks of all time, because they had to be curbed so massively. And speaking of the dreaded SnipSnap Warlock, here's Alpha talking about SnipSnap Warlock, aka just stick it once. And pretty much what he's talking about here is that this deck literally would kill you if you had 1 mech on the field. All it took was 1 mech. And sometimes you could just literally create an entire board that was so big that your opponent could not do anything to stop it. And this is also another thing that was kind of a problem with SnipSnap Lock, is that I don't know if this was necessarily bots or if it was people like cheating the game or one way or another, but there's a glitch that you could do to where you could play more SnipSnaps than was physically possible. Like there was some kind of like APM bot or hack or something to where you could literally play the card on your mech as soon as SnipSnap was available, because with the way the Echo worked, you had to wait for the animation to attach itself, and then the Echo card would appear in your hand before you could play it again. So you actually had to wait a little bit of time, and that's why Blizzard decided to wait so long, because this was one of those decks that APM was very, very important. However, the thing that wasn't great about this deck is that you could literally die turn 3, turn 4 consistently, dude. Like, it was, oh my god, it was the most obscene deck that didn't get a nerf for the longest time. If you think Darkglare Warlock is toxic now, you should turn back time about a year or 2 ago, whenever SnipSnap Lock was possible, and you should see just how uninteractive some of those games are. I'm sorry, but Darkglare Warlock has nothing on SnipSnap Lock, according to my opinion. Andrew was talking about debatably one of the best warrior decks of all time, and that is pre-nerfed Grim Patron Warrior. Hard to master, but great deck to play, and loved it. I think a friend of mine has nightmares about the deck. Don't worry, a lot of us have nightmares about everyone gathering in a tavern. Everyone get in here, as I used to say. But this deck was absolutely amazing, and was 100% the reason why Warsong Commander was nerfed so brutally. Because the way that Warsong Commander used to read, and I think is the way that it reads now because of the reverts, is that all of your cards with 3 attack or lower have charge. Grim Patron was literally a 3 attack minion that could summon another Grim Patron, another 3 attack minion, if you just damaged it. And Warrior, we know, has this thing about dealing damage to literally every single minion, so Grim Patron was a problem, to say the least. I mean, Warsong Commander. I keep getting confused with the other 2 mana card. But Warsong Commander is a really powerful card for literally this exact reason, because Grim Patron Warrior could OTK you if they had the right amount of board clears. But this was one of those decks that was really hard to master, because you had to count board space, you had to count how much damage you had. You were almost like playing like a control mid-range deck that had like a combo at the end of it. So you had to not only keep in mind about how much your combo was, because board space is very, very important. That was like the hardest part about this deck. But you also have to be able to control your opponent until you pop off the combo turn. But pre-nerf Grim Patron Warrior was debatably the best deck on the ladder, and was also probably the deck that was featured in most of the Tempo Storm meta snapshots at the time, because this deck was just, oh, it was good. It was good. There's no other way to describe it. This is probably one of the best Hearthstone decks that has ever existed in history. And keeping on the Warrior track, Dabs is talking about Enrage Warrior, another perfect deck in Hearthstone, and I'll give you my opinion here in a second. But honestly, these points ring very true. It had resource management that was very, very crucial. If you misplayed it, you were not playing the deck very well. It was very, very limited. So, like Sky Pirate, for example, you only had so many ways of being able to generate random cards. It had a versatile game plan to where one turn would happen, and then your next turn would appear, and then it's like, wow, I don't even want to do the same thing that I did last turn. I have to either clear or gain armor or do something. It has explosive potential. We've all seen that with Armorsmith and Bloodsworn Mercenary, and it also had one of the highest skill caps in Hearthstone's history. So whether or not this is the best deck that has ever existed, I would argue that this is one of the hardest decks to try and master. I would put it up there with like Turtle Mage, actually. But Enrage Warrior was one of those decks to where it was always relevant. It got nerfed, I think, 2 or 3 times. Yeah, the Angar nerf and the Blood Boil Brute, those were 2 nerfs that definitely impacted the deck. I don't think there's anything else aside from that. Oh wait, there's also Corsair Cache. So this deck actually had 3 nerfs to it and was still really good before Risky Skipper eventually rotated, because that was the power card. Let's be honest. Risky Skipper was the whole reason why you played Ankar, to try and draw your pirates. But No Hands Gamer really hit the nail on the head with this one, because he was the one that invented this archetype, and everybody just stormed to it because it was so powerful. Enrage Warrior is the perfect Hearthstone deck according to Dabs. I would say that it is definitely up there in terms of power level. Is it the best deck? Probably not, but I think that actually it was the best deck in its meta. So that, I think, kind of deserves a point to some degree. Grandmaster Rami is a huge Wild fan, so it doesn't really surprise me that one of his favorite decks was actually Savich's Weasel Priest. It was essentially a deck that was highlighting Amara, the one of the quest cards for Priest, where if you play Deathrattle minions, you can get yourself a minion that resets you to 40 health instead of 30 health. So it's like Reno, but a little bit better. And Priest actually has a lot of Deathrattle minions, so this synergizes a little bit better than Reno in some aspects. But Weasel Priest, particularly, was a deck that brought back Weasel Tunneler, which is a 1-mana 1/1 Deathrattle. Shuffle this card into your opponent's deck. So needless to say, this was an archetype that was all about just filling your opponent with useless minions in their deck. Like there's nothing they could do with it. Like they just had a weasel, they had to play it, and then you would get the weasel back, and then you would just play it again and give it back to your opponent. Like this was an absolutely toxic deck, to say the least. And I find it hilarious that Savich, of all players, had such a hilarious time with this deck. And it's just like, I don't know, man. We really haven't seen a lot of interesting Priest archetypes such as this, except for like maybe the Albatross Priest, which is kind of like Weasel Tunneler, but a little bit better, just because you're shuffling not only 2 minions, but it's also a Deathrattle, so you can keep bringing it back. Very similar to what you would do with the Weasel. But Weasel by itself, just with that little laugh, that little laugh was just absolutely perfect to go up against it a whole bunch. Definitely a toxic deck. Definitely not something that you want your friends to go up against. But if you're on stream and you're trying to make some funny highlights, this was the deck to play, and Savich had a lot of fun with it. And clearly, Rami has a very positive memory of this deck, so not everybody hated it. Brent Jacob is saying that pre-nerf Togwaggle Druid, that thing was deadly. And actually, I used to play this deck a lot. This is a deck that I brought to a DreamHack, actually, because I thought this deck was really, really good. Unfortunately for me, Togwaggle Druid was a little bit above my my skill cap, because there were a lot of times to where you had to decide whether or not you were going for the full combo of doing the Togwaggle Azalina, to where you can just literally steal your opponent's deck, or there were some ways to where you could just literally steal your opponent's deck without playing the Azalina. Because something that you could do is, if your opponent had 10 cards in their hand, you could literally just play Togwaggle, and then suddenly you don't have to even play Azalina because you're making your opponent take the fatigue. So there's actually a lot of really interesting gameplay situations to where Togwaggle Druid was a hard deck to play, and if you could play it perfectly, it felt like it was one of the best Hearthstone decks out there. Unfortunately, aggro kind of got in the way of it a little bit, especially as more expansions came out and Togwaggle started to become a little bit less powerful. But the archetype pretty much rang true. Like Dream Petal Florist got a little bit of Pig Latin going on there. But that card was a 7-mana 4/4, which would literally discount a card in your hand by 7. So literally just slap that on a Togwaggle or on Azalina, and you have your combo set up perfectly. So it was an easy combo to set up, but it was a difficult deck to master, and that's something that I love in Hearthstone. To where the combo isn't necessarily the hard thing, it's whether or not you pop it off now, you pop it off later, you try to kill your opponent with it, you try to outvalue them. Like, this was a deck where you really needed to have experience with it in order to do well with it. So Togwaggle Druid is definitely a cool deck in my eyes. Whether or not it's the best deck is definitely up for debate, but a cool deck that does well definitely gets points from me. Doc McButt is talking about Big Priest. That's it. That's the tweet. Big Priest is probably one of the most consistent decks that is still plaguing Hearthstone's wild scene to this very day. Unfortunately, Big Priest is never going to go away because they keep printing cards for it. Blood Cahoon was a perfect example of what Big Priest did not need, but was given anyway in order to make the archetype even more frustrating. I have never seen that card see play in Standard, and I don't think we ever will because, unfortunately, Standard Priest doesn't have a reason to play big minions from their deck like that. Like, this was a Big Priest card, to be honest. And the thing I don't like about Big Priest is that there's a lot of decks that just straight up lose to it the moment that Shadow Essence comes down. You hit Shadow Essence into like a big minion, then all of a sudden, all your revive cards just completely blow your opponent out of the water if they're playing something like an aggressive deck that can't kill you past like turn 4. But the other thing about Big Priest that I particularly enjoy is the fact that it falls victim to a lot of the combo decks that I come up with. Unfortunately, if I have a deck like a Charged Devilsaur combo, it's probably not going to work too well. But with a lot of the combos that I have set up, it's mostly just one card hitting face. I don't have to worry about their boards. So Big Priest is the ultimate stall deck against a deck like mine that usually will just combo you. So stall doesn't really work against combo. That's one reason why I don't mind it, but it's still a frustrating deck. Whether or not it is one of the best decks in history is actually pretty up for debate due to the fact that we literally see it every single freaking expansion in Wild, and we can't get away with it. So it's a powerful deck. It's a good deck. Whether or not it's the best deck, I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, it's the archetype that keeps popping up in Wild. I'd love to know your guys' opinion on it because Big Priest, when it works, feels very unbeatable. Drago Ninja is saying Cubelock was hands down one of the best decks, with only Raza Priest able to come close to the power and flexibility with what the meta threw at it. And actually, this was one of my favorite metas of all time. I was almost going to say that Raza Priest and Cubelock, I think, are the best decks that have ever existed in Hearthstone. But once we get to the end of the video, I will tell you guys what I actually believe is the best deck. And it's not because I think it's the most powerful, but it's because it's my personal favorite and what I climb the best with in Hearthstone. But in terms of power level, Cubelock and Raza Priest were so insane where, like, every single lineup during this tournament meta was either countering these two decks or playing these two decks. Like, there was no in between. You were not like, oh yeah, maybe I won't go up against the Priest. Like, you knew you were going up against Raza Priest because it was so powerful. But Cubelock was definitely another deck that I enjoy because of the cube. Another deck with cube. I love Carnivorous Cube. I would love to see more decks like this, and unfortunately there were only 3 classes, maybe 4 kind of, that got to use Carnivorous Cube. But Warlock was the one that was on top with Carnivorous Cube because this card was just insane. Double Doom Guards, double Void Lords, and Wild you had double Mal'Ganis. Not really the greatest thing, but being able to have double Immune was pretty freaking cool. But Cubelock was just a deck that was insane. They had to nerf, like, I think 4 cards from the deck. Let's see, there was Dark Pact, there was Possessed Lackey. Those are the first 2 cards that came up. I don't know why I can't think of anything else, but I think there are some other cards that were nerfed in the deck because it was just so freaking good, dude. Like, you played Cubelock and your opponent automatically hated you, and this deck is actually still playable in Wild, and you can still win with it. So it's kind of difficult to win with it in Wild because it's very, very dependent on maybe like your Skull plays and being able to cheat out minions with like Void Caller and stuff like that. But Cubelock, when you go up against it and you're a control deck that has a little bit of an issue dealing with large threats and sticky threats that you can't necessarily get rid of cleanly, this deck was definitely a threat to say the least and was probably one of my favorite Warlock decks that I've ever played. Zeldig is talking about old Reno Mage when Mean Streets of Kyrgyzstan came out, or just Reno Mage in general. Just love that deck archetype. I actually fondly remember the very first time I saw a Reno Mage, and that was when I was playing at a place in Indianapolis called eBash, which unfortunately is no longer in business. But it was like this place where you could go do tournaments, play on consoles and PCs if you didn't have these things for yourself. But it was just mostly where the Indianapolis Hearthstone scene could gather for a little bit. And I met one particular friend named Mbari who played this deck in like the top legend meta, and I think this is right when Wild came out, because he was massively into that format. But Reno Mage was something that was like really crappy at the beginning, and the main reason why people played it is because you had Ice Block into Reno in order to fully heal up your hero with no problem. But the issue with this deck is that it had no way of actively killing you. Years and years later, we have cards like Luna's Pocket Galaxy. Okay, can you guys hear that? Yeah. Someone had to go and start a fire on one of my videos. Nah, it's okay. I'll just keep this in here for the funny joke. But regardless, Reno Mage was just one of those decks to where it got more and more support because, let's be honest, Reno decks just need one card to do well half the time. And if you print one really good card, it's going to take over the 30th card in this deck, no problem. But this deck just kept getting more and more support. Luna's Pocket Galaxy, like I said, was one card that definitely pushed it over the edge in today's Wild meta, to where you can just do insane turns with it. Nowadays, it's not really that powerful, but it can do some cool things every now and again. It's just not the go-to Reno deck, and it's not the go-to Cabal deck because you have freaking Reno Priest being a thing still. But if you're looking for an interesting deck that can win and actually catch your opponent off guard, I would highly recommend this one, because, I mean, Reno Mage is just a cool deck that has unusual ways of winning. But with Luna's Pocket Galaxy, nowadays you're just spamming big minions with insane battle cries. But it's a deck I definitely enjoy. Martian Boo, though, is taking a very brave approach and saying, is there any question with OGER Warrior? I mean, the stats alone, look at this deck. You got a 3-mana 4/4. You got a 4/2 weapon that can sometimes miss the enemy minion that you're trying to hit. You have Ogre Magi, something that's been in the deck since the very beginning. Sunstruck Henchman, I don't even know what this card is. I don't know what a lot of these cards are, but they got Ogre in the name, for crying out loud. Like, look at this deck. Look at the pure stats and how much beef there is in this deck. Clearly, this has to be one of the best Hearthstone decks that has ever existed in the meta, because when else are you going to be able to put every single Ogre in a deck and fill up the deck completely? I think Warrior might be the only one that can do this, so clearly, OGER Warrior might be one of the best decks in Hearthstone. I don't know. Have you played the deck? You can't judge it until you play it, so until I see somebody with a 0% win rate with this deck, I'm going to say that this is one of the best decks in Hearthstone. Thanks for the inclusion, Martian Boo. G-Money is talking about Spiteful Summoner Druid, and this was a deck I played a ton, but decided not to bring to tournaments because this is also when Jade Druid was still a thing, and unfortunately Jades could just consistently win the game, versus Spiteful Druid just wants to be able to play the Spiteful Summoner, pull out the Ultimate Infestation, and then summon like a 12/12 that can't be targeted by spells or hero powers, named Tyrannus, because when that card got pulled, that was the high roll. That was the turn that you wanted to reach, and if I remember correctly, the only manage sheet that you really had was Greedy Sprite, so you could potentially do this on turn 4 if your opponent killed the Greedy Sprite and you had coin. So this was a deck that could literally just win on turn 4 because you had the Spiteful Summoner bring out a big minion. But aside from that, this deck also had Kelazeth. If you guys remember the arguing point with Kelazeth, he was literally the best turn 2 outside of recent meta Deck of Lunacy builds, where if you played him on turn 2, you had the highest win rate out of anything in the meta. There's also MCTs, which would make this deck completely annoying to go up against. You had taunts. You had things that buffed up your minions. This is a very minion-based deck because the only spell that you could afford to run was the Ultimate Infestation, so you could pull it off of your Spiteful Summoner. This is also one of the only decks that I've seen Grand Archivist actually perform somewhat decently, because if you needed to draw quickly, you could just play that, draw 5, and this deck was playing almost every single one of its cards because you needed minions on the field. And then let's not forget the Death Knights. The Death Knights were massive during this meta. But again, this was kind of overshadowed by by J Druid at the time. This was still a good deck, though. People were definitely playing it if they thought J Druid didn't go into a lineup very, very well, or if you're just trying to go for like a scam lineup. But I would say that this is not necessarily one of the best decks of all time, but it was very powerful because there was a time that Druid was just literally the best class ever. Just the best class. There was a time after Knights of Frozen Throne came out where every single tier 1 deck was a Druid deck. But guess what? Druid was so good that it wasn't even considered tier 1. It was tier 0. Druid had its own tier above the tier 1. So definitely got to remember that whenever it comes to problematic classes in Hearthstone, because Druid seems to always be something that breaks the meta in one way or another. We got yet another vote for Cubelock. Petros Man is saying that Cubelock with Doomguard during Kobolds and Catacombs. It was fun to play, it was strong, it had cubes, which is one of the best cards in Hearthstone, it had Gul'dan, which is one of the best hero cards in Hearthstone, and it had N'Zoth, which is one of the best old gods in Hearthstone. I mean, it had cool stuff, what makes Warlock fun, at least for me, and it was a tier 1 deck. Just straight up, by far, one of the best decks in the meta. And honestly, of all time, this definitely holds true. We already talked a lot about Cubelock, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But there's a lot of people that are saying Cubelock. I think this is the 3rd or 4th reply that I've seen so far, but unfortunately, I can't get to all the replies in this video. We had a lot of people talk about decks, and I only have so much time. But regardless, Cubelock is always going to be a cool deck because I want Cube back. Blizzard, if you're watching this, please give me my Cube back. I would love to see it again. And just one more thing before I move on to the next one. Kobolds and Catacombs really just struck gold for Warlock. All of their cards were amazing. Void Caller, Dark Pack, Cube, freaking, oh my god. All the cards that were available in Warlock at the time were just so freaking good at this expansion that it felt like Warlock, they stole every good card in the freaking game at the time. They had freaking Defile, they had AoE, they had healing. It felt like they literally had everything, and they even had damage with Doomguard and cubes now. So this deck was really powerful at its conception, and the only thing that really was able to stop it was a deck that came in the next expansion because of Knights of the Frozen Throne and Weasel Priest. So Cubelock is definitely one of the best decks of all time. I would argue it is maybe top 5, one of the best decks of all time, just due to the fact that it had so many ways of killing you, so many ways of defending, and so many ways of just being non-interactive. Anthony, though, is talking about Starliner Druid, and Starliner Druid was just one of the most consistent wild decks that has ever been conceived due to the fact that Juicy Psych Melon would draw all of the combo pieces that you need. It gave you your Aviana, your Coon, and your Starliner, and unfortunately I can't remember what 8-drop that was played in this deck, but it really didn't matter because the only thing that you had to do was just do a brand combo with your Starliners, and it was just game over. I don't think there was room in order to do a Zola combo, but regardless, this deck was just one of the most toxic decks that has ever existed in Hearthstone. And I remember Dane absolutely hating this deck and took a break from Hearthstone because of how insanely consistent it was. It was a deck that just pissed off every single wild player during this moment, and I'm really glad that they changed Aviana because it stopped Psych Melon from breaking the game. Psych Melon now is a balanced card because it's not just pulling out a combo that wins as soon as possible, but it's just one of those things to where now we can actually play a deck that has some kind of weird interactions and maybe has these big minions we want to pull. It's a combo card. I mean, it's a puzzle combo card again versus just being, oh, we always do this with Psych Melon, and I love to see some more versatility in Hearthstone. Starliner Druid was absolutely absurdly consistent though, and I'm glad that they curbed the deck because it was just way too good. Zorb is talking about Nomi Priest, the only priest I really enjoyed playing. And I remember saying early in this video that one of the only priest decks that I liked was actually Raza Priest, but I do have to call myself a liar because Nomi Priest was another deck that I played a ton of, and there was one particular thing that you could do with it to where you mill out your deck with Gadgets in and early card draw turns and cheap spells and stuff like that. But then the cool thing that you could do with Nomi is that you play the Nomi and then you seance it back into your hand. So you could essentially have 3 full waves of Nomis if your opponent had ways of being able to clear the first 2. And if you have an entire board survive of the Chef Nomi minions, I believe that is 42 damage. That is 6 times 7. I don't know why I thought 36 immediately because I'm just bad at mental math, I guess. But regardless, Nomi Priest was a really interesting archetype. It was not the best deck by any means, but it was one of the coolest decks to play in Priest. But it was very all or nothing. because you had the gadget combo, you had the Nomi combo, you really didn't have any other ways of being able to play your cards. You were pretty much playing a bad control priest with a bad win con, but there were some decks to where they literally couldn't deal with how early priest could draw. There were some turns to where you could play Nomi on turn 7 if you were lucky enough. Sometimes I would just win the game, and I really do enjoy Miracle decks. I enjoy Miracle Priest, Miracle Druid. There's not really that many Miracle Paladins, but I've found a way. But I really enjoy Nomi as a card. It's another card similar to Mecha'thun, to where you have this weird win con that you have to try and build around, and once you build around it, it is just so much fun. So Nomi Priest, not one of the best decks in the meta, or one of the best decks in history, but definitely a cool deck. Definitely a cool deck. This is actually the first time that somebody has said this today, and Tommy is talking about Pirate Warrior. Fun, balanced, and interactive. Nothing like killing your opponent on like turn 4, turn 5 with large amounts of damage that they can't deal with. This is probably one of the best decks that's ever existed in Hearthstone, let's be honest, because it literally stuck around for an entire competitive season, and it's still actually doing really, really well in Wild. It's just kind of curbed and not just as good as you probably remember it. But when this deck was first a thing, when you had patches with charge instead of nothing, this deck had a lot of damage. Small Time Buccaneer was a card that probably caused a lot of people to quit the game. This was definitely something that popped up in Warrior a ton. But Pirate Warrior, really good aggro deck. It's pretty much the main reason why a lot of people played Warrior. It's one of the reasons why my good friends decided to play Hearthstone for a while, but then once everything got nerfed, she stopped playing it, unfortunately. But it's still a really good deck. I would say that Pirate Warrior is probably, I don't want to say it's top 5, but I want to say it's like top 10 best decks that has ever existed in Hearthstone. But in terms of just like what like casual players or newer players could do, this would definitely be one of their top 5s because they would always win with it or always lose against it. This is now like the 3rd or 4th person that I've seen put down Patron Warrior, so I think Patron Warrior might have to be the thumbnail of this video, even though it's not going to be the best deck that I want to reveal to you guys. But another really good deck is Kingsbane Rogue. There's been so many ways that this deck has changed throughout time, where nowadays it's just a hyper aggro deck that is aiming to kill you by like turn 6 with like a 13 attack weapon. Right now, Rogue has so many ways of being able to give itself large amounts of attack on its weapon and be able to fodder out the weapon with cards like Raiding Party and Shiny Finder, so drawing the weapon isn't even that hard nowadays. Martian Boo ended up performing really well with Kingsbane Rogue last season. Since then, he's been playing Shaman memes, but he literally ended up getting himself to like top 50, top 25 with a Kingsbane Rogue list, and nowadays it's just so freaking good, dude. Like, if you want to play Wild and you want to play Rogue and win, I would highly suggest Kingsbane. And it's just one of those decks to where it's always been good. Like, when it was, I don't want to say standard, but whenever it was, like, in the main format, this deck was definitely very, very powerful. A lot of people hated it because they didn't like the amount of damage that it could exert. But if they were to play Wild nowadays, I think they would love to go back in time and go up against Kingsbane Rogue to what it used to be, because good lord, the deck nowadays is just so hyper aggro, it's not even funny. I would probably put this in like the same tier as like Pirate Warrior in terms of like top 10 decks in Hearthstone, because at least nowadays this deck is just so ridiculously fast to where it just doesn't feel fair a lot of the time. I remember one video from, I think it was like Carbot or something like that, where it was literally a long Kingsbane weapon against like Hunter with like Candle Shot or something. So when you put things in that perspective, it's just not really fair. But Kingsbane Rogue is definitely a cool deck if you want to do something like generate an infinite weapon value. Like, because that's pretty much what this deck is. Infinite weapon hits, infinite weapon damage. And as long as you don't die to fatigue, you should be okay. But that's the cool thing about Kingsbane. You play Kingsbane, you hero power, and you have no cards left in deck, and you can literally avoid fatigue. How is that not cool? Like, whether or not this card makes you upset or something, that's one thing. But this is a cool card that has a lot of applications. So Kingsbane, unfortunately, has to go up there in one of the best decks of all time, even if you don't enjoy going up against it. As we keep going through this list, we're seeing a lot of the same cards. Cubelock, another Togwaggle Druid, Naga, Giants. We haven't really taken the chance to talk about Miracle Rogue yet, and Miracle Rogue is probably one of the best decks that existed in Hearthstone's beginning because of how good just Gadgetzin was at 5 mana, and Rogue had so much damage that it wasn't even funny. Like, you would literally play cards like Eviscerate and Shadow Strike? And cards like Sinister Strike as well, due to the fact that it would just literally kill your opponent. And cards like Sinister Strike because it was all about getting as much damage as quickly as possible. Cards like Prep also really helped Miracle Rogue. And nowadays it's in a little bit of a different shell to where minions like Field Contact and Battlecry cards are the way that you draw stuff instead of Gadgetzin and spells. So it's a little bit of a different take, but it's kind of like the same thing. Miracle Rogue I don't think is ever going to die as an archetype because people love the archetype so much, and it got so much of an occult following at the beginning of Hearthstone that Blizzard is probably just going to keep printing cards that make Miracle Rogue possible because, let's be honest, people love Rogue because it feels like cheating to a degree. You're cheating mana, you're cheating cards from your deck, and sometimes you're cheating your opponent out of their HP. But Miracle Rogue is definitely something that is going to stay in Hearthstone. It is probably one of the top 5 decks that have ever existed in terms of like how good it was and how often it keeps coming back in the meta. But whether or not it was the most powerful of these decks is, you know, a little bit up for debate. Because keep in mind, being the deck doesn't necessarily mean that you're the most powerful. Powerful, in my opinion, is doing stuff like cube combos and being able to, like, deal a whole bunch of damage all in one turn, while best can refer to consistency. Miracle Rogue is one of the most consistent decks that Hearthstone have ever seen, and will continue to see because drawing cards is always going to be good. That is how good Miracle decks are, because there's nothing more powerful than drawing a card in a card game when you're trying to find an option. So Miracle Rogue definitely goes up there in the tier list for me because of how consistent it is in the meta, in every single meta that it's ever in. Raven's Son is talking about Quest Mage. It's time to unnerf it, by the way. It can't be more threatening than Mozaki or Celestial Alignment. I think if they unnerf Quest Mage, it's going to absolutely dunk on the meta again, because there are so many ways that Mage can still discount cards and can find random spells like it's absolutely nothing. And a lot of them are 1 mana nowadays because of cards like Wand Maker, cards like Ray of Frost, and just there's so many ways that Mage can find random cards. Let's just not go into the conversation of nerfing the spell. But the quest definitely is really, really powerful because it's had several metas where it was relevant. And when it first came out, it was kind of a meme where you could do things with Exodia Mage, and I actually ended up bringing that to a Tespa match. So it was, and it won a game. It won a game, so it did pretty well. But as this card became, you know, a staple in Mage, and as more cards were printed and Mage kept getting more random generation, it became out of control. Nerfing it to 8, I think, is definitely healthy. I don't want that to change because things like Vargoth easily break the card, and Giants are always going to be a thing. I do not want to see Quest Mage with Flamewaker anymore. I'm tired of seeing Flamewaker, to be honest, and I've played that deck to rank 3 Legend before. I played Quest Flamemaker Giants Mage when it was relevant. It was the highest... Well, it used to be the highest Legend rank I ever had in Wild at the time, and then I reached rank 1 with the deck that I will be telling you guys at the end of the video. But I think that Quest Mage has a ton of uninteractability that I don't want to see in Hearthstone again. Taking 3 turns, no matter how you look at it, is absolutely insane. Going back to the best versus powerful, I would argue this deck as best and powerful because the explosive turns that were possible were absolutely mind-boggling, and it was so consistent in being able to exert that much damage. So Quest Mage, I think, is one of the best decks that has ever existed in the game because it keeps coming back over and over again. Even when they nerfed it, it still had a point where it was kind of in the loop. It's not so much anymore because combo decks need a lot more time and in this hyper-aggressive meta that we have right now. But Quest Mage just doesn't make the cut anymore. But you cannot deny how insanely powerful its synergy was before the nerfs and before the changes happened. So Quest Mage is definitely still up there and best decks for me. And the best deck that we'll talk about before I tell you guys what my best deck at Hearthstone is Shudderwock Shaman. Something about infinite damage. You have cards like Grumble, you have Serenite Chain Gang, and you have Shudderwock to just absolutely win the game, and Life Drinker just put everything all in one place, because this was the Battlecry card that made Shudderwock Shaman so freaking good. I don't think that we're ever going to see another Battlecry card like this, because it's almost like a power creep of Nightblade. It's 1 mana less and it heals you. It doesn't have the same stat line, but it's also a beast. So Life Drinker is just one of those cards that literally enabled an entire combo, even though cards like Serenite Chain Gang and Grumble were very important in order for Shudderwock to be this good. But if Shudderwock didn't have the damage and the healing, that's very, very important that it was damage and healing, I don't think this deck would have been nearly as consistent. I actually loved Shudderwock Shaman back when it came out, until I lost a 3% against a Warrior and ended up losing in a top 8 Copa America tournament due to my Shudderwock essentially failing at 3%. So since that happened, I've been kind of having a love-hate relationship with this card, but I've memed with it. I've done a lot more with this card since then, so I am willing to forgive you, Shudderwock, if you do what I want you to do from now on, and nowadays you've been doing that, so just keep the good work up, buddy. But this deck is definitely one of the most frustrating decks that was ever in the meta, but also was kind of beloved by a lot of people. Like Shudderwock Shaman, people were always complaining about losing to it, but whenever you were playing it, it just felt like the best deck, or one of the most fun decks that you've ever had. So like Shudderwock, I think definitely has to go up there in one of the best Hearthstone decks, maybe not even like top 10, because there's just so much like, there's not a lot of wiggle room when it comes to like best decks in Hearthstone because of like things that have been nerfed and yada yada yada. But Shudderwock is another one of those cards that just feels so frustrating to lose to. So a lot of people kind of make it more of a problem than it actually is. But I mean, think about this, man. Like, repeat all of the battle cries. Every single battle cry that gets printed is now going to buff Shudderwock one way or another. I still enjoy this deck massively, though. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that it was a really good deck. It was one of the best decks that has ever existed because it put Shaman back on the map when Shaman had no other way of being played. And let's be honest, Shudderwock is a cool card, even if you lost to it a lot. So that begs the question, guys. What does Clark think is the best deck in Hearthstone? And well, it's the one that I got one of the best ranks I've ever received, and it was with Anyfin Paladin. This is the different version of the Anyfin Paladin that most people are used to, because they're probably either used to the combo that either plays Tip the Scales or the old-fashioned control deck, which would literally just try to wait for the longest time, kill off all the minions, and then play Anything Can Happen. But this is one of my favorite decks that has ever existed, because I actually got to play Anyfin Paladin with Finja. Finja is one of my favorite cards because I used to play a lot of Water Rogue when that was relevant, and it was just definitely a deck that had a lot of different ways of being enacted. But the reason why I love this deck the most is because I climbed to my best ever rank, and I finished at rank 6 Legend with this deck about 2-3 years ago. I think it was like 2018, 2019. But this is just the deck that I've taken to the massive heights in my Hearthstone career, and I also did well in tournaments with this deck. Like, every single time I need to like play Hearthstone for fun, I will literally just copy and pasta this deck, because it's not the greatest one out there, but it's very, very consistent. It was essentially a mid-range deck to where you could cheat the game with High Priest the Call into Molten Giants if you wanted to just, you know, turn 2 kill your opponent every now and again. But aside from that, it was just a tempo deck that aimed to draw out its deck with cards like Call to Arms, pulling out things very, very easily. You have plenty of cheap minions that are always on the board and forcing your opponent to either clear or to actively present their own threats. You have Tarim, good card, and then you have the Anything Can Happen combo if you do need to burst your opponent, which was definitely needed every now and again against some priests. But I had some of the best times in Hearthstone with this deck. As you guys can see, I made it to Legend multiple times. I even made my own posts about this, and this is pretty much like how I started getting my foot in the wild scene, was when people were retweeting my deck and being like, hey man, Anyfin Paladin's actually pretty decent. And this is just a cool deck. I have to give a huge shout out over to Jakasau for literally introducing me to this deck back when he was playing. I don't know if he's still in it nowadays, but if he is, definitely give me a shout out, buddy. I would love to see you nowadays. But regardless, love this deck. Loved everything that was possible when I was playing this at the time. Rallying Blade is one of my favorite weapons because of all of the Divine Shield synergies, and Finja will just always be one of my favorite Murlocs because of what it could do in multiple different avenues. But Anyfin Paladin is my best deck in Hearthstone because not only did I have the most consistent win rate and hitting rank 1 Legend, I've never done that before except with this deck, but it was just a really fun deck that I have a lot of positive memories with. But that is going to be it for today's episode of the best decks in Hearthstone according to my Twitter. Thank you guys so much for watching yet another episode of Hearthstone Hypotheticals. If you guys enjoy this content, feel free to like this video and to subscribe to the YouTube channel in order to be notified about any other future uploads we happen to come out with. I'm going to be doing a lot of work today in order to make sure that the daily content is going to be brewing because I have a lot of these posts to catch up on. So definitely make sure that you're checking out the Twitter to see when we post whatever questions. Today's question that we're asking is, what are the cutest cards in Hearthstone? This video might be coming out in about 3 or 4 days because I have 3 other threads that I have to make videos on, as well as some other combo stuff that I have planned. But guys, if you do enjoy this stuff, check out the Twitter. Be sure to make sure you're part of the YouTube fan. And if you want to check out the Twitch channel, that's also another way you can get interacted with us. But I always love chilling with you guys. If you ever have a question or a card that we didn't cover in today's topic, feel free to let me know what you guys think is the best deck in Hearthstone. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you for the next one.